Good morning and good morning. We are right now in the month of Av, also known as Menachem Av. Menachem is a biblical name that means consolation or comfort. And this is the month in which we seek to be comforted because of all the tragedies that began on this month, particularly Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month, which is the anniversary of the destruction of both temples, about 500 years apart one another. And it's axiomatic in Talmudic and Midrashic literature, based on biblical sources, that these two temples, though they were destroyed by evil people, the Babylonians in the case of the first temple, the Romans in the case of the second temple, and there's no excuse for them, but the sages of the Talmud and Midrash, taking their cue from biblical verses, try to identify the causes in terms of what we did wrong. And Maimonides puts it when he says that whenever you see something tragic happening, you shouldn't just say, well, it just happened and it was a coincidence, but everything has a purpose. I can't say that the reason why a tragedy happened is because so-and-so did something wrong, and I can't identify that, but a prophet could identify that. But what we all could say is that God is trying to take us out of our reverie. He's trying to wake us up to recognize that we have to change our own lives, and that will have an effect in the future. So rather than talking about what happened in the past, we're talking about how we could correct the problems that we have, that our people suffer from, in terms of guaranteeing the future should be a future of goodness and peace and everything positive. So with that introduction, there's a passage in the Talmud that identifies some of the causes of the destruction of the second temple, mostly the second temple. The first temple, it's stated in the biblical text, that was destroyed because primarily the moral level of the Jewish people was very down. People were engaged in idolatry. People were engaged in sexual crimes, in bloodshed, didn't respect the sabbatical years. Those are things that are identified in terms of the first temple. But what was the reason for the second temple? The state of the Jewish people's level of learning Torah was on a high level. They were not idol worshippers. They were not engaged in sexual crimes. So what was the problem in the second temple? And the Talmud, and the sage who says this is a Rabbi Yochanan, and I'm mentioning his name deliberately because it'll come in to the discussion. Rabbi Yochanan was the first generation Talmudic sage after the Mishnah was compiled. He was a disciple of the editor of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. This Rabbi Yochanan identifies the sin for which the second temple was destroyed as Sinat Chinam, senseless hatred. What does the word senseless hatred mean? If you hate someone because they hurt you, that's not a nice thing to hate someone. You have to deal with it, but it's not senseless. When you hate someone just because they exist and there's no good reason, that's called senseless hatred. So that's what he identifies in one passage in the Talmud. Here's a passage in another tractate of the Talmud, a tractate called Gittin, which deals with divorces. Here, the same Rabbi Yochanan gives a different explanation as to what caused the destruction of the temple. Many commentators say that he's trying to illustrate the Sinat Chinam, the senseless hatred, but we'll soon see if that fits into the text or not. So let's do the text over here, where Rabbi Yochanan is identifying the cause of the destruction, but he introduces it by the following words. What is the meaning of a verse? This is a verse in Proverbs. Fortunate is the man that always fears, and he that hardens his heart will come to harm. This verse is illustrated by the story over here, where you see a tragedy occurred because people failed to recognize the consequences of their actions. People did not realize how their actions may seem to be minor, could result in something catastrophic. So here's the story, and the famous story is known as the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. And here is what he says. Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. These are two individuals. We don't know much about them. It sounds like, if you translate the words bar is Aramaic for son, like bar mitzvah. So Kamsa, some people suggest, was Bar Kamsa, was the son of another man who was also named Kamsa. So we'll soon see about that.
Is it a father and a son?
That's what it sounds like. The Kamsa was the father, and Bar Kamsa, the son of Kamsa. So it doesn't give you his name, so we just call him Bar Kamsa. But it's not even sure that this is father and son. That's speculation. The Talmud does not tell us any more about them. Now, there was a certain man whose friend was named Kamsa. This certain man is not identified. We don't know his name at all. But he had a friend whose name was Kamsa. But he had an enemy whose name was Bar Kamsa. That could lead to some confusion. You know, someone once calls up the law firm of Greenberg, and Greenberg. And the person says, can I speak to Mr. Greenberg? Oh, he's not in. Can I speak to Mr. Greenberg? Oh, he's busy. Can I speak to Mr. Greenberg? Well, he's not taking any calls today. And he goes through the whole list. Finally, he says, can I speak to Mr. Greenberg? Speaking. So when you have the same name, it can cause problems. So here you have similar names. And this guy had his friend was named Kamsa, but his enemy, his bitter enemy, and we'll soon see how bitter he was in terms of his enmity, was Bar Kamsa. And this man made a large feast, and apparently at this feast he invited all the dignitaries and all the leaders and all the rabbis of Jerusalem. And he said to his servant, go bring me my friend Kamsa. And the servant went and mistakenly brought him his enemy Bar Kamsa. It's very easy to confuse the two names, so he invited the wrong person. The man who was hosting the feast came and found Bar Kamsa sitting at the feast. And the host said to Bar Kamsa, that man, he used the third person, but he meant you, is the enemy of that man. That is, you are my enemy. What then do you want here? Arise and leave. Bar Kamsa, of course, was embarrassed to leave. So Bar Kamsa said to him, since I have already come, let me stay and I'll give you the money for whatever I eat and drink. I'll pay for my meal. Just do not embarrass me by sending me out. The host said to him, no, you must leave. Bar Kamsa said to him, I will give you money for half of the feast. Just do not send me away. The host said to him, no, you must leave. Bar Kamsa then said to him, I will give you money for the entire feast. He wasn't a poor man, apparently. Just let me stay. The host said to him, no, you must leave. Finally, the host took Bar Kamsa by his hand, stood him up, and took him out. Not a very nice thing to do. After being cast out from the feast, Bar Kamsa said to himself, since the sages were sitting there and did not protest the actions of the host, although they saw how he humiliated me, you could learn from it that they were content with what he did. They were happy. They agreed with what he did. There's a general principle in Talmudic law that silence is like affirming what the other person says. If someone tells you something and you're silent and you don't protest it, you don't disagree with it, it sounds like you agree with it. So he said, and he presumed that that was the case, that the rabbis agreed with his being thrown out of the party. So he said, I will therefore go and inform against them to the king. In other words, go to Rome and tell the emperor in Rome that the Jews are fomenting a rebellion, and the rabbis are the leaders of this rebellion. And he went and he said to the emperor, the Jews have rebelled against you. The emperor was skeptical. He said to him, "Who says that is the case?" And Bar Kamsa said to him, "Go and test them. Send them an offering to be brought in honor of the government, and see whether they will sacrifice it." See, the Romans were very big on sacrifices, and they enjoyed the fact that even though they were not Jewish, if they would send an animal to be sacrificed in the temple on their behalf, they were very pleased with that. So he says, send them, you'll see, and it probably was the custom that the Roman leadership would send animals to be sacrificed, and the rabbis would have it sacrificed. There's nothing wrong with that. So, but there's a little catch over here. The emperor went and sent with him a choice 3-year-old calf. While Bar Kamsa was coming with the calf to the temple, he made a blemish on the calf's upper lip. Some say he made the blemish on its eyelids, a place where, according to us, that is, according to Jewish law, it is considered a blemish. But according to them, the Gentile rules for their offerings, it is not a blemish. It's a very minor, you can hardly even notice that injury. And Jewish law does not allow you to sacrifice a blemished animal. The animal has to be perfectly healthy. And if there are certain blemishes, then the animal is no longer fit for it being sacrificed. But in this case, the way the Gentiles ruled for their offerings, it's not a problem. Therefore, when Bar Kamsa brought the animal to the temple, the priest would not sacrifice it on the altar since it was blemished. But they also could not explain this satisfactorily to the Gentile authorities who did not consider it to be blemished. The blemish notwithstanding, the soldiers thought to sacrifice the animal as an offering due to the imperative to maintain peace with the government. The question over here is, what do they mean to maintain peace with the government? Probably it meant if you start up with the Romans would not be very kindly disposed towards you. The Romans, what they hated more than anything else was rebelliousness. They accommodated the needs of the Jewish people. They allowed the temple to stand, and they allowed the Jews to bring sacrifices, and even sacrifices for the Romans. But if you started up with them and you showed them that you're into rebellion, and there were many groups at that time that were fomenting a revolution against the Romans, and the Romans were aware of that, this could be disastrous. And as it turned out, it was disastrous in the end. So here they thought, maybe we should bring the offering. Even though it's against the law, it's a question of life and death. And Jewish law says that when something is in matter of life and death, it takes precedence over any of the commandments, with the exception of 3 commandments, which we won't go into right now. But this is not one of them. So they thought they're going to bring the sacrifice. Now there was a Rabbi Zakaria ben of Kulas, and he said to them, if the priests do that, if they offer the animal, people will say that blemished animals may be sacrificed as an offering on the altar. The rumors will go out that they offered a blemished sacrifice, and people are not going to know that this was because it was to save themselves from the wrath of the Roman government, and it's a matter of life and death. So people will say you're allowed to sacrifice blemished animals. And as some commentators point out, the danger, anytime there's a corruption, a potential corruption of Jewish law, some people felt that was a matter of, that it overruled the considerations of life and death even. That's what Rabbi Zakaria was saying, that would be a terrible blow to the integrity of Jewish law. But the sages then said, if we do not sacrifice it, then we must prevent Bar Kamsa from reporting this to the emperor. We have to get rid of him. Why get rid of him? Because he's a musser, he's an informant. And an informant is a threat to the lives of the people, and you're allowed to kill the informant. This happened even in Middle Ages when Jews didn't have autonomy. They had limited autonomy in some cases, and when someone got upset at the Jewish community and informed to the government, and that could lead to pogroms, they were allowed to eliminate that person. So here's the danger. If we don't sacrifice it, then we must prevent Bar Kamsa from reporting it to the emperor. The sages thought to kill him so that he would not go and speak against them. Rabbi Zakaria said, no. If you kill him, people will say that one who makes a blemish on sacrificial animals is to be killed. And there's no such death penalty for causing a blemish to a sacrificial animal. So he said, you can't sacrifice it, and you can't kill him. As a result, they did nothing. In other words, they did not bring the animal. They didn't sacrifice the animal. And Bar Kamsa's slander was accepted by the authorities, and consequently, the war between the Jews and the Romans began. So this is the conclusion of this story. But then you have Rabbi Yochanan's editorial comment. He's the one who introduced the story. And the purpose of introducing the story was to illustrate how some small event could precipitate a much larger consequence. And Rabbi Yochanan says, the excessive humility of Rabbi Zakaria ben Avkulas destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. So there are many, many questions in this story, and that's what we're going to be discussing. First of all, the reason why we discuss this actually on Tisha B'Av, many people study this on Tisha B'Av itself, because it illustrates the causes for the destruction of the temple which occurred on Tisha B'Av. But in which tractate is this? This is tractate Gittin. Gittin means divorces. Why is it explained in this tractate of Gittin, of divorces? It has a very far-fetched connection to the topic that's being discussed. So some say it's because the relationship of God and the Jewish people has been compared to a divorce. At Mount Sinai, that's when the marriage between God and Israel was initiated, and exile that resulted from the destruction of the temple is like a form of a divorce. So that's why the destruction of the temple's discussion appears in a tractate that deals with divorce, because it's a spiritual form of divorce. And what chapter is it in? It's a chapter called the damages, Hanazakin, damages, how to make restitution for damages. So that implies that, yes, we caused a lot of damage, but damages can be compensated for. We can repair it, and we will repair it, and we'll see that with the building of the third temple by Mashiach. I said this in an earlier class this past week. One of the greatest rabbis of the Middle Ages was Rabbi Gershom, who was the rabbi in the city of Mainz, Germany, about over 1,000 years ago. And he is referred to by a title that no other great sage has been given. He's called Me'or HaGola, the luminary of the exile. He illuminated the exile. And the question was asked, why did he get that title more than other great rabbis? A student of his student was Rashi, who was even more famous than Rabbi Gershom, and he's not referred to with that title. Maimonides is not referred to with that title. And they're much more famous than this Rabbi Gershom. What made him so famous? So this is an explanation. I don't know the source of it, but it's a very famous one. And that is that he instituted two laws, two bans that illustrate the point how God is so close to the Jewish people. What are the two bans? According to biblical law, a husband can divorce his wife without her consent. A husband does not need the consent of his wife to divorce her. And that's the reason why Jewish law requires a marriage contract that obligates the husband to pay a large amount of money in the event of a divorce to deter him from divorcing his wife. But Rabbi Gershom went a step further. He put a ban on divorcing a woman against her will. That's one ban. Another ban was, according to biblical and Talmudic law, polygamy is permitted. You can marry more than one wife. He put a ban on that, and since he was the leading Ashkenazic rabbi, Ashkenazic Jews accepted that ban without questioning. Sephardic communities did not accept that ban, but mostly they do it anyhow, but the Ashkenazic Jewry has that ban. And what does that have to do with us being in exile? When we are in exile, it sounds like God has divorced us. So Rabbi Gershom says, no, God, you can't do that. You have to follow your own rules. I ban divorcing a wife against her will. We don't want to be divorced, so you can never divorce us. But then there's a danger. God could say, you know what, I won't divorce you, but I'll marry another nation. Another nation will be my chosen people. So Rabbeinu Geshem says, no, you can't do that. Polygamy is banned. And God cannot marry another nation. So that's why he's called the light of the exile, because he illuminated the exile, making sure that the exile does not constitute a divorce and does not allow God to choose another nation.
How could he make a law that tells God what to do?
That's a great question.
Okay, good question. There's a famous teaching in the Midrash that whatever God commands us to do, he does as well. That our commandments are reflections of what God does. And since the Torah obligates us to follow rabbinic laws, it's one of the commandments in the Torah, whatever the rabbis legislate, we are bound to follow them, then God must also follow them in his own way. Yes?
And maybe to help illustrate this point, isn't there was the court proceeding where someone said it went counter to the law, and then God said, my children that I've done, we expressed it with joy.
Okay, but it's going to get us too much off the subject. That deserves a whole class of its own. Yes?
You said that it was Midrash that gave the Jews the right to hold God to the same thing, correct?
That's the source where that's mentioned.
Well, that's just Midrash.
But Midrash is divine as well. We believe, if you talk about Judaism, traditional Judaism, Midrash is as divine as the Bible. There's no difference.
Midrash is they're just stories.
No, it's not just stories. And it's based on a biblical verse in the book of Psalms where it says God tells his words to the people. The words and his statutes he gives to the people. That's in the end of the book of Psalms. That the commandments that he himself keeps, that's what he gives his people. This is basic Jewish belief.
But there was also the daughters who argued for a portion of the land.
Yeah, God allows people to argue with him. Sure.
And it changed the law.
Right, and God said, you're right, I agree. Yeah, you can do that. But God has to agree.
Did God give any recognition to this idea that he can hold you to the same law that when man says something, if he's a high enough authority, that he can put this restriction on you?
God does whatever he tells us to do. He doesn't deviate from what he tells us. That's the basic premise. But let's taking us off the subject. I just mentioned that as a minor point. We'll talk about that some other time, about the authority of the laws to dictate what God does. But that's by God's choice. God could choose to do whatever he likes.
But God gave us the choice to choose whatever we want. So then if we have that law, then God has the right to choose whatever he wants.
Now, we don't have the right to choose. We have the obligation to choose. We have the ability to choose, not the right to choose.
The will, right.
If I have the ability to commit a crime right now, that doesn't give me a right to do it. I have the ability to do it, but not the right.
Just because we can doesn't mean we should.
Right, absolutely. So let's get back to this. So the main point was that exile is likened to divorce, and if there is a restriction on divorces, then God is restricted as well by his own choice. Now let's go back to the story itself. It says the Talmud makes it very clear in the title of this story that the temple was destroyed because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. What in the world did Kamsa do wrong? He wasn't even there. Remember, the story is this guy has a party, someone who we don't even know. The Talmud doesn't identify what his name was, and by mistake, the servant invites Bar Kamsa to the party. That means Kamsa was not invited. He didn't know about it. So why does the Talmud say that it's because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? This preoccupies many of the commentators trying to figure out what did Kamsa do wrong. So the simplest explanation is it doesn't mean he did something wrong. It's because of the confusion of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, which is sounds like a minor mistake, that precipitated a colossal disaster in the end. And that's to teach you how important it is not to overlook small details. Sometimes small details can grow into mountains of effects, of consequences. So it's not that Kamsa did anything wrong, according to this interpretation. It's that because of the confusion with his name, you have to be very careful when you invite someone. You know, I know people who didn't get an invitation to a wedding because the mail, for some reason, didn't deliver it. Anyone who sends out invitations, hundreds of invitations for a wedding or any other event, will discover that some of those invitations do not reach their destination, and then people could become enemies for life. Why wasn't I invited? So little things could have very major consequences. That's one approach. But most of the commentators don't take that approach. Most of the commentators say Kamsa was guilty of something. Now there's an interpretation which is half in jest. It's not. I don't think it's a serious one. But the one that says that Kamsa was guilty, why wasn't he there? Well, he wasn't invited. If you're his friend, you don't come only because you're invited. You show up at the wedding anyhow. If you really feel that you're good friends, you don't have to stand on ceremony. You come to the event. So Kamsa, the fact that he was a good friend of this man, the man invited him because he was his friend, and he doesn't show up because he wasn't invited, means that this friendship was not a real friendship. It's not a genuine friendship. And that was one of the problems that the Talmud is trying to illustrate, that the people's relationships were flawed. People's relationships were not healthy relationships. That's a half in jest, that interpretation. But others say other things. One of the great commentators of the 16th century, known as the Marsha, he's the one who proposes that Kamsa and Bar Kamsa were father and son. Kamsa is the father, and Bar Kamsa is the son. Where did Bar Kamsa get his evil from? Because Bar Kamsa was an evil man, there's no question about it. Because you're slighted and embarrassed, you incite the Roman government against the Jews to murder 2 million Jews. That doesn't mean that what you did was justified. There's no justification for what Bar Kamsa did. He seems, if you ask me, who is the most evil person in this whole story, it's Bar Kamsa, without any question. And the fact that his father is Kamsa, and it sounds like that Kamsa was also not a very decent person. It's possible that the father could be a saint and the child could be a villain, but the speculation here is that Kamsa himself was remiss in the way he raised his son to be such an evil person. Some say if Kamsa knew that the host hated his son, here your best friend hates your own son, wouldn't he have done something about it? Something is wrong. There's a lot of dysfunction over here. This whole relationship over here was a dysfunctional one. The Maharal, another great 16th century sage, he suggests that his love of Kamsa was insincere. Sometimes you choose friends because they hate your enemies and they support you in opposing your enemies, not because it's genuine friendship. So it's another theory that the friendship over here was not sincere, and they try to read that into the name Kamsa. Kamsa might not even be a real name; it might only be a nickname. What does the word Kamsa mean? It's an Aramaic-sounding word, but it sounds like a Hebrew word, kometz. Kometz is a handful. When they had to bring an offering in the temple of flour, you would have the Kohen, the priest, would take a handful. What does taking a handful mean? That you're separating. The idea of taking a handful is to separate something from something else. These friendships were all about not unity, but about division. The very antithesis of unity, because these people were trying to develop relationships based on cliquish considerations. we're together in this because that's our enemy. So you're only joining the other. Let's look what happens in the world today. Iran and Hamas are bitter enemies. They're Shiites versus Sunnis. They hate each other more than, almost as much as they hate Jews. I was about to say more than they hate Jews. No, it couldn't be more, because then they wouldn't have gotten together. But to oppose Israel, they became friends, and they'll embrace even. You'll see pictures of the Ayatollah embracing the leader of Hamas, which is a sick phenomenon, because you know how much they really hate each other. But to get together, and that's what seemed to be there, that this friendship was not an authentic friendship. There's another Hebrew word that is related to the word kamsa. Kamsa in Hebrew means someone who's stingy, someone who doesn't want to share anything with anyone, very stingy. Again, it's the idea of you want to keep everything for yourself. You develop, and your friends are those people who will just enhance your own status, especially when there is so many different divisions amongst the people. Some say that the word kamsa is translated as an ant or a grasshopper. When the spies came to Israel, they saw giants, and the way they described, the giants looked at us and they thought that we were ants or grasshoppers. That's a sign that you have an inferiority complex. You think of yourself as a nobody, and you think everyone looks at you as a nobody. When you have people who have such an inferiority complex, that can become a very negative force, because then you depend on your clique for support. Let me just mute everyone. Okay, so we now know Bar Kamsa was evil because he did what he did. We can speculate about Kamsa, what he did wrong, if he did anything wrong. But let's talk about the host. The host is not even identified. Why isn't the host identified? Does anyone have a theory?
Maybe it's not relevant to the story.
It's very relevant. The host did something horrible by embarrassing this man in public. And
It probably wouldn't have mattered whether it was this host or another host. The fact that he didn't have faith in God to ascribe the slight as a part of God's process and took it upon himself to seek recognition.
But what the host did was embarrassing another human being, and embarrassing is tantamount to bloodshed, the Talmud says, because you cause their face to turn white, and then the blood rushes back, so it's bloodshed, and you're destroying someone's dignity, and their personality is affronted. So he did something terrible, there's no question about it. So why is the host not even identified? And why doesn't it say the temple was destroyed because of Kamsa, Bar Kamsa, and the host? So the most plausible theory is that what the host did was actually justifiable. That this Bar Kamsa was known to be an evil person. Now, this is only historical speculation. Some people suggest in the works of Josephus, there's a person, two people whose names are very eerily similar to Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, Komsos. And the theory is the Jews were split into two camps at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. One camp was loyal to Rome, and the leader of that camp was actually the greatest rabbi of that time, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He was totally against any type of rebellion against Rome. He said the time is not ripe for it. We have to pay taxes to them. We have to show allegiance to Rome. Otherwise, there'll be a catastrophe. That was the opinion, and that was the major force in the Jewish community of accommodating the Romans, not rebelling against them. Things changed decades later when Rabbi Akiva, who was the greatest rabbi of his time, supported Bar Kokhba in the rebellion against Rome. So things changed in a course of about 100 years, or less than that. So that was one camp who wanted accommodation with the Romans. And it seems that Bar Kamsa, if this is true, that Bar Kamsa is that person identified by Josephus, he was of that camp, and he was very loyal to Rome. And that's why he was able to get to the emperor. Could any person say, I want to speak to the emperor, I have something to report? I mean, it's hard to get an audience with the emperor, but because he had some very good ties with the Romans, he felt that he had that clout. That's one possibility. Whereas the host and the rabbis were anti-Rome, because the rabbis were also split about it, apparently. Because we know, again from Josephus, that a rabbi whose name is eerily similar to Zakaria ben Avkulas was against fighting, was for fighting the Romans, was for rebellion. So this is the theory, and I'm not totally convinced of it, that this was a major dispute about should we support Rome or should we rebel against Rome. At any rate, the host, when he saw Bar Kamsa coming there, he knew Bar Kamsa was someone who was collaborating with the Romans, and he was a very dangerous man. He was an informant. Apparently they knew that he would be an informant, so they threw him out, not realizing that the things will get even worse. But at any rate, no matter what the theory is, one thing is clear, that Bar Kamsa was not a nice guy. And the host was perhaps justified in throwing him out because he was such a vile person. But my question is another question. The same Rabbi Yochanan, who's telling this story, says clearly that the second temple was destroyed because of senseless hatred. Now, what is the definition of senseless hatred? Hatred, not because of you have an ideological dispute, that's bad hatred, but it's not senseless hatred. Senseless hatred is you just can't tolerate the other person. Not because of anything they did to you or anything that they have done to others, not because they're bad people. You just can't tolerate because your ego is so big you can't find room to accommodate any other person who steps on your turf. That's what it sounds like. Otherwise, what does it mean to have senseless hatred? Most people who hate others hate them because of a reason, because they did this to them. They have the wrong ideas. You have political hatred and rivalry because you have different ideologies. But if someone who has the same political position as yourself and agrees with you on all basic issues, and you still hate them, that's senseless hatred. But here it wasn't senseless. Here the hatred, it seems, was justified. They hated Bar Kamsa because he was an evil man who would collaborate with the Romans and would even go to the extent of informing against his own people to invite the Romans to destroy the temple and murder millions of people. So it wasn't senseless. That's my question. If anyone has an answer? Yes.
If the host had just let it go, if the host had not embarrassed Kamsa, would the outcome have been different?
I assume so. Bar Kamsa would not have reported that the Jews were rebelling against them.
So maybe the senseless hatred of the host for Bar Kamsa.
I just explained that it wasn't senseless, that Bar Kamsa was an evil man. Otherwise, the host would have been more severely criticized.
But was it worth throwing him out for what occurred after?
No, it wasn't worth. And no question, it was a mistake because they invited the Romans to do what they did. No, it was clearly a mistake. Everyone here in this story made a mistake. It's just a collection of mistakes. The guy throws this party and invites Kamsa, and the servant goes and brings in Bar Kamsa. That was one mistake. The next mistake was that he threw him out. He wouldn't let him pay for the meal and let him stay. He threw him out. And the next mistake was he went to inform against them. The next mistake is that they wouldn't offer the sacrifice and they wouldn't kill Bar Kamsa to prevent him from going back. So it was just a collection of mistakes. And that's Rabbi Yochanan's point, that sometimes mistakes could be deadly. But my question still is, why is this called senseless hatred? So I have a theory that senseless hatred is not necessarily what I just said it means, that you hate someone for no other reason than the fact that they exist. That's one form of it. But any time your hatred becomes pathological, when it goes to extremes, and you do things that are crazy, things that are abnormal, things that are that don't make any sense, that's senseless hatred. That doesn't necessarily mean you hate him for no reason. You can have a good reason to hate someone. If someone cuts you off while you're driving and they threaten to kill you and they take out a gun because you cut them off, that's senseless. Why is it senseless? They have a good reason. I mean, you cut them off, but the reason doesn't justify the reaction. That's what senseless means. In the Torah, there's an expression. There's a story of Bilam, the heathen prophet who came to curse the Jews, and it says he saddled his own donkey. So the rabbis say, and Rashi quotes this, that he was a very dignified person. He had servants. Why would he saddle his own donkey? He says, because hatred can cause a person, it disrupts normalcy. When you hate someone so much, it could cause you to do things that are irrational. The same thing with love. Abraham, when God tells him to bring his son and is testing him if he would sacrifice his son, it says Abraham saddled his own donkey. Why would Abraham saddle his own donkey? Didn't he have servants? He had servants because his love for God and to do what God wants him to do disrupts normalcy. When you love someone so much, you'll do something for them that's beyond rationality. So love and hatred are opposites, but they have the same effect, that if you take it to an extreme, you'll do unconventional things. You'll do things that make no sense. So senseless doesn't necessarily mean there's no reason for it, but there's no reason why you're doing it in such an extreme. That means that the hatred has penetrated to the core. Because there could be hatred, but it's superficial. And it could very easily be, changed. Someone did some harm to you and you hate them, and then the person comes and apologizes and sends you a gift. It's going to be hard for you to keep that hatred going. That's if the hatred hasn't reached the core. But if the hatred reaches the core of your being, it becomes pathological and you can't control it. And I think that's what the Talmud is trying to illustrate over here, that Bar Kamsa's hatred was so pathological and so intense that he couldn't justify rationally his response to it.
What about the host? Getting back to the host.
The host was justified to some extent in doing what he did, because Bar Kamsa was a bad judgment call. No one questions the fact that everyone here did something wrong. Everyone in this story, no one comes out innocent. But there's a difference between Bar Kamsa informing against the Jews to the Romans and the host throwing him out. Throwing someone out, perhaps it was justified, as I said before. So the host may not be as guilty as the others. Neither were the people who stood by and didn't say anything. No one is justifying them, but their hatred was based on legitimate considerations, that this man was an evil, vile man and a dangerous person, especially if you believe in the historical analysis that Bar Kamsa was a supporter of Rome, and they were anti-Romans, and you didn't want him to be in the same room. What do people discuss at the parties? Politics, and they're going to start talking against the Romans, and he's there listening, eavesdropping. They didn't want him there, so it could be they were justified in throwing him out. But it was a mistake, nevertheless. But it wasn't as serious a mistake as what Bar Kamsa did. Now, why didn't the leaders protest? Again, because they felt that he was a criminal. He was a horrible person. Now, the end of the story is the excessive humility of Rabbi Zakaria destroyed our temple, burned the sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. It seems Rabbi Yochanan makes the rabbi the most guilty person of all. He doesn't say because of Bar Kamsa, because of Kamsa, because of the host, but because of the rabbi. But I think what he's trying to say is not that the rabbi was the most responsible, but when someone in that position of leadership makes a mistake because of their humility even, we'll soon see where the humility comes into this, that could have the most dire consequences. So it's not that the rabbi was the most guilty one. No one is suggesting that, because the rabbi didn't really do anything, negative. What he did was, it was because he was passive. What does it mean that he was humble? He is one of the leading rabbis, and he should have taken up a strong position, but he didn't have a strong position. He was wishy-washy. A leader cannot be wishy-washy, and a leader who's wishy-washy will end up causing big problems. So the Talmud is trying to illustrate how small issues can become major issues. Some say that his humility was that in the Sanhedrin, in those days they had the Sanhedrin, where the questions of Jewish law are deliberated by the 71 judges. Now the way it would work is that the junior judge would say his opinion first. Because if the senior judge would say his opinion first, the others would be afraid to contradict him. So they wanted to hear everyone's opinion. Now, Rabbi Zakaria was one of the senior members. And yet he was so humble, he didn't want to express his opinion as a senior member. And therefore, they didn't get to any final decision. Some say because he actually went first and expressed his opinion, which was not an opinion. Had he not been so humble, he would have listened to everyone else, and he would have come up with the right decision. At any rate, some suggest another thing. In another version of this story in the Midrash, the story appears in two sources, the Talmud and Midrash. In the Midrash version of it, Rabbi Zakaria was at the party as well. He was one of the rabbis at the party. And he didn't speak up, because although he probably thought that it was wrong for the person to be thrown out, he was too humble to express his opinion. And when you're a leader, you can't allow humility to dictate your decisions. Now, of course, if you go the other extreme is also bad. If the person is an egotist and has no respect for anyone else and doesn't consult with anyone, that's also bad. But you have to have the healthy combination of humility and firmness. Actually, yesterday we read the Torah portion that deals with leaders, and the name of the portion is matos, which means staffs. A staff is a solid stick that doesn't bend. You have to have someone who's strong, who's able to express an opinion and doesn't give in to others, because it's more popular to say things that are contrary to what you know is right. So you have to be humble on one hand. A king in Judaism has to be the most humble person and the strongest person. He has to do both. When a king would say his prayers, he had to bow the whole time. Anyone else didn't have to bow the whole time. The higher you are, the more humility you need, but it has to be healthy humility. So if we have to decide who was the biggest villain, Kamsa, Bar Kamsa, the messenger made a mistake. The host, the rabbis, Rabbi Zakaria, the emperor, who would you vote for as the biggest villain in the terms of the destruction of the Second Temple?
The messenger, because if the messenger didn't bring him over there, none of this would have happened.
No, I don't think so.
Out another rabbi, because he could have stopped there.
Right. The answer is the emperor. You can never take the blame off the person who unleashes a war in which close to 2 million Jews, innocent men, women, and children, were murdered mercilessly. And when people talk about what happened on October 7th, who was the most guilty party? I know people will say, well, it was Netanyahu because he didn't anticipate this, and it was this general who didn't do this. No, it's Hamas. Who was responsible for the Holocaust? You can blame a lot of people for what they didn't do right and didn't respond. We could blame the Allies for not bombing the railroads or the concentration camps. No, it's the Nazis. Those are the most guilty ones. It's very important that we don't have moral equivalency, that everyone who is somehow guilty, they're all equal. They're not all equal. So while we don't vindicate someone because he had a minor role, it doesn't mean you can equate that person with the ones who had the major role. So it's certainly the emperor who's the real villain. Who was the emperor who destroyed the temple? It was Vespasian. And his general was his son, Titus, who later on became the emperor. So these are the people who deserve the greatest amount of criticism. But if you leave out the emperor and you look at the others, I would say Bar Kamsa comes next, because he literally went to the Romans to get them to clamp down on the Jewish people. As far as the others, it's a toss-up. We could.
Vespasian.
Well, at that point, it may have been Nero, actually, because the Talmud doesn't give you the whole history. It doesn't tell you all the events. This is like one of the earliest parts of the tragedy, and Nero started the process. But then you know what happened to Nero, and then it was taken over by Vespasian. Vespasian was actually the general when he came to Israel to besiege Jerusalem. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wanted to make a deal with him. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai couldn't get out of the city of Jerusalem. Why not? Because the Biryonim, the zealots, the extremists who were pro-fighting the Romans, what they did is they had burnt all the supplies of food, of fuel in Jerusalem to force the Jews into fighting. And they knew that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would try to make an accommodation with the Romans. So they would not let him leave the city. If they would try to leave the city, they would stop it, even though he was the leading rabbi, and everyone respected him. Even his enemies respected him. So what did they do? What did he do? He feigned illness, and then a few days later, it was announced that he died, and they took his body, he was very much alive, to the gates of Jerusalem to take him to the general. So the guards there said, "We don't believe he's dead. Let's stab him." And the student said, "Know what the Romans are going to say? Look at these Jews. They stab their own rabbis." And the zealots were very much into showing pride as Jews. We're going to fight the Romans. And they said, "Okay, we won't do anything." And he got out of the city, and he was brought to Vespasian, and he called Vespasian, "Your Majesty." And Vespasian says, "You deserve the death penalty on 2 counts. Number 1, I'm not the king, I'm not the emperor, I'm just a general, and by calling me Your Majesty, that's rebellion. And you deserve the death penalty for that. And secondly, if I'm the king, where were you until now? We're besieging the city for years, and you didn't come to me So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that they didn't let me out. And there was a dialogue back and forth. But meanwhile, he said, "Why did you call me Your Majesty?" He said, "Because I know that the temple will only be delivered in the hands of a king, not in anyone lower than the king." And as they were talking, a messenger came from Rome that said that the Senate made him the new emperor. And that's when he left. He went back to Rome and he sent his son Titus. So then the end of the story is somewhat sad. So the king was so impressed with him that the king said to him, "Ask me anything and I'll grant it to you." And he asked for 3 things. There was a Rabbi Tzadok, very holy man, who fasted for 40 years. He didn't eat anything during the day, and he was very ill, undernourished. If you can send him a doctor. Then he said the family of Rabbi Gamliel, who was the Nasi, the leader, the spiritual leader of the Jewish people, don't murder that family, keep that family alive. And the sages who had been exiled from Jerusalem to the city called Yavna, spare that city, that little town. And the king agreed to those 3 requests. And the Talmud says, why didn't he ask for Jerusalem? Why didn't he ask for the temple? So the Talmud gives 2 answers. One answer, he knew that he wouldn't he would never grant that. The Romans, it would be an insult to their pride. 2 years they're besieging Jerusalem. The powerful Roman empire, powerful Roman emperor can't conquer a little country like Israel and the little city like Jerusalem. So that was too big of a prize, so that he knew he wouldn't get it. So he asked for things that are major, but don't appear to be major, so that the king would grant him.
The sages in Yavna were the reason for Jewish continuity, right?
Right. But the king wouldn't recognize that. He wouldn't realize appreciate how important that was.
At that time, people probably couldn't have recognized that.
Right. So then the second answer the Talmud gives, there's a verse, I believe it's in Proverbs, that sometimes God causes wise people to think backward. When God has a plan, He'll make the smartest people say stupid things, because God is ultimately in control. As much as we want to think that we're in control, God is in control. So God wanted the temple to be destroyed because the people were not respecting it properly. There was so much, in our prayers we say, bless us God as we are all together as one. When there's such division, God feels uncomfortable. Imagine you're invited to come to someone's house for a meal, and you see the husband and wife fighting with each other. Do you feel comfortable being there, sitting at that meal? No, you'll say, excuse me, someone just called, I have to go. God doesn't feel comfortable dwelling in a place where there's such division and such enmity and such hatred. There were a lot of different reasons given for the destruction. Rabbi Yochanan is the one who says it's because of baseless hatred. There are other reasons given, and we don't have time to go into all of them. But where does hatred come from? Hatred comes ultimately from the ignorance of the other person's true value, because you only see the surface. Because one of the reasons given, a different reason for the destruction, was that people did not appreciate the value of Torah. They didn't say the blessing. When we study Torah, we thank God first for giving us the Torah. For not saying the blessing, that means that you don't really fully appreciate the value of Torah. Your appreciation for things is superficial. One of the biggest causes of all of our problems that start off not being a problem is when people are superficial. When people look at things of value with very superficial eyes. When people look at themselves superficially, when they look at others superficially. And that's exactly the point. How could you have senseless hatred? Because you don't really recognize who the other person is. What do you see? You see their faults. You see the surface. You don't realize that there's something beneath the surface that deserves to be respected and loved. And sometimes by showing that love, you'll cause the things that are underneath to surface. But if you show hatred, you're going to suppress the good in that person. So all the reasons, if you really think about it, all the reasons revolve around one point: not seeing things more than they are on the surface, never going beneath the surface. And that causes all the negative. So all these are symptoms, and the symptoms come from one source, not going deeper beneath the surface of God, deeper surface of Torah, of the commandments, of people. And when we probe beneath the surface, that's how we rebuild everything. We rebuild, and ultimately rebuilding of the temple. And we hope that this Tisha B'Av, we're not going to have a fast, but if you put the letter E in the word fast, it turns into feast. And what does the letter E stand for? Echad, one, the one God. If you put the one God into the fast, it turns into a feast. If we're not aware of the oneness of God, if we compromise God's oneness, which is a sign that you don't really appreciate what God is, then that turns into a fast day. That's a negative. But if you put the Echad, also E stands for the word emes, truth. When you're in touch with the truth, then the fast turns into a feast. And there are many other words in English that begin with an E. Elohim, that's in one of God's names. Okay, any questions? Yes.
So, what occurred? I mean, you look at it, it seems fairly simple, but yet for how many, thousands of years were the Jewish people exiled. So did God take this pretty, like, so seriously that he's like, okay, you're out of there and you're out of
Okay,
there?
why are we still in exile after 1900 years since the destruction of the temple? Haven't we already paid the price for it, and haven't we already gone through enough pain and suffering? That's a question that you have to direct to God. And that's a question that all of our prayers are directed to, saying, God, it's enough. Enough is enough. We say it in a respectful way, of course, but it's still, and if you say, well, that's blasphemous, that's sacrilegious. No, it's music to God's ears. When you complain to Him, God loves when we complain. As long as we do it respectfully, and as long as we're complaining about not material things, we complain about things that have value. When the Jews couldn't bring the Paschal offering, they complained to God. Why should we be deprived? And God said, yes, they're right, they're going to get a second Passover. God didn't say, well, what right do you have to complain to me? God is God. He can tolerate our complaints. If He would be human and we would keep on complaining, God would get sick of us. You know, in Yiddish there's a term for a person like that, a nudnik. We're nudniks, but God loves it. You know the difference between a shlemiel, shlemazel, and a nudnik? The shlemiel pours hot soup on the lap of the shlemazel, and the nudnik asks, was it chicken soup or was it vegetable soup? So we're all nudniks, but in a good way. Okay, any other questions? By the way, Rabbi Yochanan is identifying early causes, very early causes, and small little details. The same Rabbi Yochanan once said that if I was around then, I would have made the fast not on the 9th day, but on the 10th day, because when the temple was ignited, it was at the end of the 9th day. The bulk of the temple was consumed on the 10th. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan says it's not over. The famous rabbi said that it's not over until it's over. Yankel Bera, you heard of him? It's not over until it's over. Even as the temple is now on fire, we're not going to grieve for it because there's still a possibility of averting the end of the destruction. So while Rabbi Yochanan is able to identify the source, the seeds, he also says, I'm not giving up until it's really over. There's still always hope. Never say, oh, it started, it's too late, I can't bring it back. Yeah, you shoot an arrow, you can't retrieve the arrow, but God could. So a tragedy could happen. There's no guarantee that tragedy has to ensue, has to continue.